I've been a trucker for almost 15 years now. I've seen just about everything you could see on the road: accidents, strange people, wild animals darting out in front of the truck, you name it. But one night, about 3 years ago, I saw something I still can't explain. It was late November, cold and dark. I had a haul taking me from San Antonio up to the Canadian border. My route took me through Oklahoma and then Kansas. I was on a stretch of highway called Route 77, one of those old, lonely roads with very little traffic, the kind of road where you drive for miles without seeing another soul. I'd been on the road for hours and could feel myself getting tired, so I started looking for a place to pull over. The radio was playing static, not a single station coming through. The road was empty except for the occasional farmhouse off in the distance, just a light or two shining in the field. Then I saw it, a small, old-looking gas station up ahead. The neon sign was flickering, barely lighting up the words, 24-hour gas. I didn't see any other cars there, but at this hour, I wasn't expecting a crowd. I pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine, breathing in the silence. I figured I'd grab a coffee, maybe a snack, and stretch my legs before getting back on the road. The station was run down, the paint was peeling, and one of the windows had a big crack running through it. But I didn't care. I was tired, and it was the only place around. I walked up to the door and noticed something odd. There were no lights on inside except for a dim glow at the back. It looked like it came from a small lamp or maybe a single overhead light. Still, the sign said open, so I went inside. The moment I stepped in, I felt a chill. It was freezing inside, colder than it had been outside, and the place smelled damp, like wet earth. The aisles were empty, shelves half-stocked with dusty cans and faded boxes. I looked around for a clerk but didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty room. No answer. The silence was so thick I could hear my own breathing. I walked toward the back, where the dim light was. That's when I noticed a figure behind the counter. It was a man, standing very still, almost too still. He looked up as I approached, and I realized he had the strangest eyes I'd ever seen, pale, almost colorless, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He asked in a low voice. "Just coffee if you have any," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. He reached under the counter and pulled out a coffee pot, but as he poured it, I noticed something odd. The coffee was thick and black, but it had a strange metallic smell to it. I forced a smile and took the cup he handed me, but something told me not to drink it. I didn't want to be rude, so I held the cup, pretending to sip. "Busy night?" I asked, just to make conversation. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those pale eyes. After a moment, he spoke in a whisper, "You shouldn't be here." My stomach tightened. I laughed nervously, hoping he was just messing with me. "Why's that?" "This place isn't meant for people like you," he replied, his voice cold and strange. "You should leave, now." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I nodded, still holding the untouched coffee cup. "All right, I'll get going. Thanks for the coffee." I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, he spoke again, this time louder. "If you see her, don't..." I froze, looking back at him. "See who?" He didn't answer. He just stared, those pale eyes gleaming in the dim light. I didn't wait for him to explain. I walked out the door, tossing the coffee cup into the trash as I went. The smell of it was still lingering, that strange metallic odor I couldn't place. I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror. The gas station looked smaller and darker, almost like it was fading into the night. I told myself it was just my imagination, just a creepy old man in a rundown gas station, nothing more. But as I drove back onto Route 77, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing his words in my head. "If you see her, don't..." The road was empty, and the fog was getting thicker. I turned the radio back on, hoping to catch a station, but all I got was static. I tried scanning for something, anything, but it was just dead air. About 20 minutes later, I saw something up ahead in the distance. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal crossing the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman, standing right in the middle of my lane. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. My truck came to a stop just a few feet away from her, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. She was young, maybe in her 20s, wearing a thin white dress that looked out of place on a cold night like this. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her shoulders. But it was her face that sent chills down my spine. She was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were dark, hollow, like there was no life behind them. I remembered what the man at the gas station had said, "If you see her, don't stop." I should have listened, but there she was, standing in the middle of the road, and something inside me couldn't just drive away. I rolled down the window, leaning out slightly. "Are you all right?" I called, my voice. She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her expression blank. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, though I knew I shouldn't have. Slowly she nodded, but something about the way she moved didn't seem right. It was too slow, too stiff, like she wasn't really there. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word, sitting beside me, staring straight at me. I started driving again, the silence in the cab thick and heavy. I tried to ask her where she was going, but she didn't answer. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road. I couldn't take the silence anymore. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and empty. "I'm just trying to get home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm not sure what to say. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the cold chill that had settled over the cab. But as I drove, I started to notice something strange. The road didn't seem to be going anywhere. No signs, no landmarks, just the same stretch of highway, over and over. My GPS was frozen, stuck on the same spot, and the clock on the dashboard wasn't moving. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop, driving endlessly with no... I glanced over at the woman, feeling a surge of panic. "Do you know where we are?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She just kept staring ahead, her expression blank. And then without warning, she looked at me, her eyes wide and empty. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice echoing in the silence. My heart pounded as I realized the truth. She wasn't a lost hitchhiker. She wasn't even human. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop. But when I looked over, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the cab was silent. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had happened. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, and it had started moving again. My GPS was back, showing my location. I didn't waste any time. I put the truck in gear and drove, not stopping until I reached the next town. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, I sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want. Since that night, I avoid Route 77 whenever I can. I've heard other truckers talk about strange things on that road, but I never tell them my story. I just tell them to keep driving, no matter what they see. Because sometimes the things you see on the road aren't meant to be picked up. And once they get in your truck, they might never leave. There's a lot you see on the road, things you can't explain. Trucking isn't a job for everyone, that's for sure. Long nights, endless miles, and sometimes you're the only one for miles and miles. But in all my years, there was one night that left me questioning everything. It was a cold October night, and I was driving through eastern Wyoming on my way to Denver. The air was thick with fog, and the road ahead was barely visible. My headlights only cut through so much of the mist, leaving everything past the beams hidden in darkness. I was hauling a load of farm equipment and was running late, but I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I'd been hoping for a rest stop, but I hadn't seen a sign in what felt like forever. That's when I finally spotted a small sign, half hidden by overgrown weeds, barely lit by my headlights. It said, "Lost Highway Rest Area, Mine." Something about the name made me pause. Lost Highway? I'd never heard of that before. Still, I didn't have much of a choice. My eyes were heavy, and my body was begging for rest. I followed the road to the rest area, relieved to finally have a place to stretch my leg. As I pulled in, the first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no other cars, no sounds, not even the rustle of wind, just silence. I parked my truck, turned off the engine, and climbed out, taking a deep breath of the cold night air. The place was small, just a few parking spaces, an old picnic table, and a bathroom building. The lights flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. I glanced around, feeling an odd sense of unease. It was too quiet, and something about the place felt wrong, but I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things. I walked over to the bathroom, hoping to splash some water on my face to wake up. The inside was dimly lit and smelled stale, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The walls were covered in graffiti, and there was a strange scratching noise coming from one of the stalls. I ignored it, figuring it was just a mouse or some other animal, and turned on the faucet. The water was ice cold, and as I splashed it on my face, I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked up at the mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me, just out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was no one there, just an empty bathroom and the flickering light. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I was just tired, that was all. I turned off the faucet and headed back outside, deciding it was time to get some sleep. But as I walked back to my truck, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a man standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at me. He was tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat that looked almost old-fashioned, like something from another era. His face was pale and his eyes were dark, hollow. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, watching me. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice shaking a little. The man didn't answer. He just kept staring, his expression blank. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and every instinct told me to get back in the truck and leave. I turned and walked quickly to the cab, keeping an eye on the stranger. But as soon as I opened the door, he was gone. One moment, he was there, and the next, he had vanished into the fog. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself I was just seeing things. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And whatever it wasn't right. I climbed into the truck, locking the doors behind me, and took a deep breath. I told myself I just needed some sleep, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I laid back, closing my eyes, trying to forget about the man in the road. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, pale and empty, staring at me from the darkness. I kept hearing strange noises outside, faint scratching sounds, like something was scraping against the truck. But every time I looked out the window, there was nothing. Finally, after what felt like hours, I managed to doze off. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light over the rest area. I rubbed my eyes, feeling groggy and disoriented, and glanced around, hoping the night had just been a bad dream. But then I noticed something strange. The man's footprints were still there, in the dirt by the side of the road, leading from the middle of the road to the edge of the parking lot. I stared at them, feeling a cold sense of dread settle in my stomach. I wasn't imagining things. He had been there. I climbed out of the truck, planning to take one last look around before getting back on the road. But as I stepped out, I noticed something else. The bathroom door was open, hanging slightly ajar. I frowned, remembering that I had closed it when I left. I walked over, pushing the door open and peeking inside. The place was empty, just as it had been the night before, but something was off. There were scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the paint, like someone had been clawing at it with their fingernail. I backed out slowly, my heart racing, and decided it was time to get out of there. I climbed back into my truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the rest area as fast as I could. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the empty road, but the feeling of unease stayed with me. As I drove, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at me. But the road was empty, and I started to relax, telling myself it was all just a bad night, nothing more. But about an hour down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the side of the road, was the same man, standing perfectly still, staring at me as I passed. His dark coat billowed in the breeze, and his hollow eyes locked onto mine, watching as I drove by. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. I kept going, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the mirror, but he was gone, vanished into the fog. For the rest of the trip, I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at anything that wasn't directly in front of me. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark figure standing by the side of the road, watching, waiting. I made it to Denver by mid-morning, exhausted and shaken. I parked the truck, grabbed my things, and checked into a motel, hoping a good night's sleep would make me feel better. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for me on some empty road, watching from the shadows. People ask me why I don't drive through Wyoming at night anymore, and I always tell them it's because the fog makes it too hard to see. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is the man on the lost highway. The one who watches, who waits, who never really leaves. They say truckers see a lot of strange things out on the road, and after nearly 20 years behind the wheel, I can tell you that's true. But there's one story I don't share too often. It's the kind of story that sticks with you, the kind that makes you feel like someone's watching. This is that story. It was late one November night, and I was on a haul from Boise to Kansas City, making my way through the winding roads of northern Utah. The air was crisp, and the only light came from my headlights and the occasional star that peeked out from the clouds. I'd driven this route a few times before, and I knew it was mostly empty, miles and miles of desolate road, just how I liked it. I was somewhere between towns, where there's nothing for miles except the faint outlines of mountains in the distance. My radio had lost signal, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:47 a.m. I had a long way to go, but I figured I'd drive another hour before finding a place to pull over and catch some sleep. Suddenly, up ahead, I spotted a figure on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. It's not every day you see someone walking alone in the dead of night on a road like this. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, standing perfectly still, just staring into the dark. Something about her made me feel uneasy. She wore a thin white dress, far too light for the chilly night air. Her long, dark hair was tangled and matted, hanging down her back. I kept my eyes on her as I passed, and for a split second I could have sworn she turned her head to look directly at me, her eyes empty and lifeless. I shuddered and kept going, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I didn't stop. I don't make a habit of picking up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe someone who had car trouble or a hitchhiker. But something in my gut told me that wasn't the case. About 10 minutes later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing even closer to the road, almost in the lane. My heart pounded as I drove past, stealing a glance in the rearview mirror. She was still staring after me, her face blank, as if she was watching, waiting. I pressed down on the gas, hoping to put some distance between us. But no matter how fast I went, that unsettling feeling wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see her again. And then, about 15 minutes down the road, there she was, standing in the middle of the lane. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. My truck came to a screeching halt just a few feet from her, and she didn't flinch, didn't move an inch. She just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, her face pale and emotionless. I sat there for a moment, frozen. Part of me wanted to just drive around her and keep going, but something told me it wouldn't be that easy. I took a deep breath, gripping the wheel, and honked the horn, hoping she'd move. She didn't react. She just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Finally, I rolled down the window, leaning out to shout, "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. She just kept staring, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. Her feet weren't touching the ground. A chill ran down my spine. She was hovering just a few inches above the road, her dress billowing in the wind, though there wasn't any breeze. I slammed the window back up and threw the truck into reverse, backing away from her. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want any part of it. As I backed up, she slowly began to follow, gliding toward me without moving her feet, her eyes locked on mine. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, but when I looked down, it was dead, the battery drained, even though I'd charged it before I left. I looked back up, and she was gone. I sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I'd seen her, clear as day, and there was no explaining it away. I took a deep breath, put the truck back in drive, and started down the road again, keeping my eyes peeled. For the next half hour, the road was empty, just the way it had been before. I started to relax, telling myself it was over, that whatever I'd seen was gone. But then I saw the light. Up ahead, there was another truck stopped on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down, hoping whoever was inside could explain what was going on, maybe tell me I wasn't losing my... As I pulled up beside the truck, I noticed the door was open, hanging slightly ajar. There was no sign of the driver, just an empty cab with the lights on. I honked the horn, waiting to see if anyone would come out. When no one did, I climbed out of my truck and approached the other rig, my flashlight in hand. I called out, but there was only silence. the stillness of the desert pressing in around me. As I reached the open door, I shined my flashlight into the cab. It was empty, but something caught my eye. On the passenger seat, there was a photo, a small crumpled picture of a woman. I picked it up, my hand trembling. It was her, the same woman I'd seen on the road, with that empty expression and long dark hair. I dropped the photo, stumbling back, my heart racing. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the air. "Help me." I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. Just the empty road stretching out. I didn't waste any time getting back to my truck. I jumped into the cab, locked the doors, and put my foot on the gas, speeding away from the other truck as fast as I could. The road blurred beneath me, my headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. For the next hour, I drove without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see her face, but the road behind me was empty. Finally, I saw the lights of a truck stop up ahead, a small diner with a few trucks parked outside. I pulled in, my heart pounding, and parked as close to the lights as I could. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaky, and made my way into the diner. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of other truckers sitting at the counter. I took a seat, my hands still trembling, and ordered a coffee. The waitress gave me a strange look but didn't say anything, just poured the coffee and left me alone. As I sat there, trying to calm down, I overheard one of the other truckers talking to the "You hear about that accident last month?" he was saying, his voice low. "Out on the northbound, guy lost control of his rig, went off the road. They say he didn't make it. His truck was empty, but they found something strange." The waitress leaned in, curious. "What'd they find?" The trucker glanced around, lowering his voice. "They found a photo, a picture of a woman. Folks say she's been haunting that stretch of road ever since, looking for someone to take her." A cold chill ran down my spine. I glanced over at the trucker, feeling my mouth go dry. I didn't say anything, just stared into my coffee. The memory of that empty face burned into my mind. I finished my coffee and got back on the road, but I never forgot that night, or the woman I'd seen. And every time I drive that stretch of highway, I keep my eyes peeled, half expecting to see her standing there, wait. I don't know what she was or what she wanted, but I do know one thing: some things are better left alone, because sometimes the road is darker than it seems. Driving at night always felt different. It was quieter, and sometimes it even felt like time slowed down. I was used to it by now, after 15 years on the road, hauling cargo from one end of the country to the other, but something about that night felt different. I was driving through Arizona on a deserted highway, with nothing but open desert on either side. The sky was dark, no moon, and my headlights were the only source of light for miles. The radio was on, but I'd lost the signal about half an hour ago, and now it was just static. I was tired, more tired than usual, so I was keeping an eye out for a rest stop. I hadn't seen one in hours, and my eyes felt heavy. That's when I finally saw a sign, "Next rest stop, mile." I sighed in relief and sped up just a little. A quick break would be enough to shake off the sleepiness, and I could be back on the road in no time. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There were no other cars on the road, no headlights in either direction, and the place looked empty. When I pulled in, I saw that the parking lot was deserted too, except for one old truck at the far end, barely visible in the shadow. I parked my truck and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath of the cold desert air. The rest stop itself was small, just a few picnic tables, a couple of vending machines, and a bathroom building that looked like it had seen better days. The light above the door flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. I glanced around, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something about the place didn't sit right with me, but I figured it was just my tired mind playing tricks. I walked over to the vending machine, planning to grab a coffee, but the machine was out of order. I muttered under my breath and turned to head toward the bathroom instead, hoping some cold water on my face would wake me up. As I stepped inside, the silence hit me. No sound of buzzing lights, no hum of air conditioning, just silence. The bathroom was dimly lit, with only a single bulb flickering above the sink. I leaned over the sink and splashed some water on my face. Looking up at myself in the mirror, I looked tired, worn out, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. I took a deep breath and straightened up, ready to head back out to my truck when I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft whisper that echoed through the empty bathroom. I froze, my heart pounding. I thought maybe it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Help me. The voice was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one else in the bathroom, just me and the silence. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Is someone there?" No answer. I waited a few moments, listening, but there was only silence. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, and turned to leave. But as I reached for the door, I heard it again, louder this time. "Please, help me." The voice was coming from the last stall at the end of the row, just out of sight. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me to get out of there, but something kept me moving forward, some strange pull that I couldn't explain. I reached the last stall and hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I pushed the door open anyway, bracing myself. The stall was empty, just an old toilet, stained and cracked, and the smell of stale air. There was no one there. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I'd heard, but there was nothing, just an empty stall and the silence pressing down on me. I shook my head, stepping back, feeling a cold sweat on my forehead. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps behind me, soft and slow, echoing in the empty bathroom. I turned around, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just the flickering light in the empty stalls. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel a presence, something watching me, something I couldn't see. I didn't waste any more time. I turned and hurried out of the bathroom, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stumbled back out into the parking lot, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the fear that clung to me like a shadow. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed something strange. The old truck that had been parked at the far end of the lot, it was gone. I hadn't heard an engine start, hadn't seen headlights, but it was gone, leaving nothing but an empty space where it had been. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors behind me, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it, a heaviness in the air, a sense of something watching me. I started the engine, ready to get out of there as fast as I could. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I froze. There, in the reflection, was a face, pale and hollow, with dark eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It was the face of a woman, her expression twisted in pain, her mouth moving silently as if trying to speak. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the empty cab, silent and still. I looked back at the mirror, but the face was gone, leaving only the empty parking lot behind me. My heart was racing, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the rest stop, my eyes flicking to the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that face again. But the road was empty, and the rest stop faded into the distance behind me. I drove for hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that I was just tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sun was just starting to rise when I reached the next town. I pulled into a diner, hoping a hot meal and some coffee would help me shake off the lingering fear. I sat at the counter, nursing my coffee, when an old man sat down beside me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice rough and raspy. I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Just had a long night." He nodded, but his eyes were sharp, studying me with a strange intensity. "You came from Highway 13, didn't you?" he asked. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah, how'd you know?" He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "That rest stop, it's cursed, been abandoned for years. People go there, and sometimes they don't come back." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "But I saw a truck there, parked at the end of the lot." He shook his head slowly, his eyes dark. "There's no one out there, just ghosts, lost souls, looking for someone to help them find peace." I didn't say anything, just sat there, staring into my coffee, the old man's words echoing in my mind. When I got back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I half expected to see that face again, those dark eyes staring back at me. I never went back to that rest stop, and I never drove down Highway 13 at night again. I'm not one to scare easy, Been driving trucks for over 20 years, hauling cargo across the country, long stretches of highway my only company. I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Ghost towns, abandoned cars, even wild animals creeping out at night. But nothing prepared me for that night in West Texas. It was early November, and the chill in the air was sharp as a knife. I had a load of electronics to take from El Paso to Houston, simple enough run. Just me, my rig, and about 12 hours of open road ahead. I'd driven through the night plenty of times before, but that stretch of road between Fort Stockton and Ozona always made me uneasy. It's miles and miles of nothing. No houses, no gas stations, no lights, just dark, empty desert. I started out just after sunset, my truck growling to life as I pulled onto the highway. The radio crackled with static, and I finally gave up trying to find a station. Just me and the hum of the engine as I watched the sun disappear over the horizon. Hours passed in silence, my headlights carving a path through the darkness. Around midnight, a fog started rolling in. Strange, I thought. Texas doesn't usually get fog this thick. It was like a wall of gray, swallowing the road, the desert, everything. The headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting anything I couldn't see. About an hour into the fog, I noticed something up ahead, a faint flickering light. At first, I thought it might be another truck, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was an old diner, one of those 24-hour places with neon lights that hadn't been popular since the 50s. The open sign blinked on and off like it was on its last legs. I couldn't remember seeing a diner along this stretch before. I'd driven this road a dozen times, and I was sure it was nothing but desert and the occasional rest stop. But there it was, clear as day. Part of me wanted to keep driving, ignore it, and chalk it up to lack of sleep. But another part, the tired part, craved a coffee, maybe a slice of pie, something to break up the monotony. Besides, I'd been on the road for hours and could use a break. I pulled my rig off to the side, parked, and climbed down, stretching my legs as I looked around. The fog had closed in tight around the diner, but I could still make out the shape of the building. It looked old, like it hadn't been renovated in years. The paint was peeling, the windows fogged up from the inside, but the lights were on, and I could see the faint outline of someone moving around behind the counter. As I stepped inside, a bell above the door jingled, announcing my arrival. The place was empty, save for the woman behind the counter. She was older, with gray hair tied back in a bun, wearing one of those old-fashioned waitress uniforms. She didn't look up as I came in, just kept wiping down the counter with a stained rag. "Evening," I said, my voice sounding loud in the quiet. She didn't respond, just kept wiping, like she hadn't heard me. "Ma'am?" I tried again, stepping a little closer. She looked up then, her eyes glassy and distant, like she was seeing me but not really seeing. "What can I get you, Honorable?" she asked finally, her voice hollow and flat. I thought it must have been one long shift for her to be this out of it. "Just a coffee," I said, "and maybe a slice of pie if you got it." She nodded, moving slow as she poured the coffee and set it down in front of me. The cup was chipped, the coffee lukewarm, but I didn't mind. I was just glad for something to keep me awake. As I sipped, I looked around the diner. The place was straight out of another time, faded red booths, a jukebox in the corner, old pictures on the wall of people who'd probably been dead for years. The clock above the counter was stuck at 3, and there were no sounds, no other customers, just that woman and the faint hum of the neon lights outside. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A man sat in the booth across from me, staring straight ahead, his hands folded neatly on the table. I hadn't heard him come in, hadn't seen him when I sat down. But there he was, clear as day, like he'd been there all along. He was dressed in an old, worn suit, the kind men used to wear back in the 52nds. His hair was slicked back, his skin pale, almost gray, and his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, like he was studying me. "Good evening," he said, his voice soft but cold. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. Something about him didn't sit right, but I didn't want to be rude. "Evening," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're a trucker, aren't you?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question, more like he already knew. "Yeah," I said. "Been on the road for a few hours. Just stopped in for some coffee." He nodded slowly, a strange smile creeping onto his face. "Long stretches of road out here. Gets lonely, doesn't it?" "Sometimes," I said, shifting in my seat. "But I'm used to it." He leaned forward, his hands still perfectly still on the table. "You ever see things out there? Things you can't explain?" I felt my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, still staring at me with those cold, dead eyes. "There are places on this road," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "where the veil is thin. Places where other things can slip through." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, chalk it up to some crazy guy's rambling. But another part, a deeper part, knew he was serious. "Ever seen anything like that?" he pressed, his voice dripping with curiosity. I thought about all the strange things I'd seen over the years, the shadows on the road, the figures that seemed to melt into the night, but I'd always brushed them off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I guess I have," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile grew wider, and for a second, I thought I saw something else beneath his skin, something dark and twisted, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. "You'll see more tonight," he said, his voice cold and certain. "Once you leave here, they'll be waiting." A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get back in my truck and drive as far away from this place as possible. I threw some cash on the counter, nodded to the waitress, and headed for the door. The man was still watching me, that strange smile never fading. As I stepped outside, the fog had thickened even more, and I could barely see my truck parked just a few feet away. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine, wanting to put as much distance as I could between me and that diner. As I pulled back onto the highway, the fog seemed to press in closer, swallowing the road. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to drive slow, my eyes straining to see. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road just ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, staring at me. It was the man from the diner. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. There was no way he could have gotten here before me, but there he was, clear as day, standing in the middle of the road. I honked the horn, hoping he'd move, but he just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. Then slowly, he raised his hand and pointed down the road, his face twisted into a grin. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to look in the direction he was pointing. And that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, lining the sides of the road, their eyes glowing in the dark, their faces twisted and hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as I sat there, frozen in my seat. The man lowered his hand and started walking toward my truck, his smile growing wider with each step. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as I swerved around him, desperate to get away. As I drove, I could feel their eyes on me, could see their shadows stretching across the road, reaching out for me. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in on all sides, and I could barely see the road ahead. I don't remember how long I drove like that, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. But eventually, the fog began to lift, and I found myself alone on the highway, the empty desert stretching out around me. I didn't stop driving until I reached Houston, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the loading dock. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself. But ever since that night, I've kept my eyes open on the road, watching for shadows, for figures that don't belong. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is empty and the fog rolls in, I swear I can still see them, standing there, watching, and I keep driving. I never thought much of the night runs. In fact, I liked them. The roads were quiet, and I could listen to my favorite stations without much trouble. But something happened last month that still has me shaking every time I pass through certain stretches of road. It was supposed to be a regular haul, just a late-night drive through the back roads to make it to a small town about 200 miles from my usual routes. They called it Crescent Ridge. I'd never heard of it, but it was a job. The company told me a client had a big shipment that had to be delivered by dawn, and the money was right, so I agreed. I fueled up, grabbed some coffee, and hit the road around 11 p.m. The dispatcher told me it would take about 4 hours if I kept a steady pace. I had a decent load, so I couldn't go as fast as I wanted, but I figured I'd still be on time. As I headed out, the road seemed darker than usual. Maybe it was the clouds hiding the moon, or maybe the lack of streetlights on the back roads, but something about it felt off. The trees leaned over the road, creating long, dark shadows that seemed to move as I passed. I tried to shake the feeling off. This was just another hall, just another road, I told myself. The first strange thing happened about an hour in. I was driving along when I saw something in the road up ahead. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer, or maybe a coyote. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. I slowed down, thinking it might be something someone had left behind, a bag maybe, or even an old tire. But as my headlights swept over it, I froze. It was a figure, crouched in the middle of the road. It looked like a person but was dressed in strange clothes, a tattered coat, with their head covered by some kind of hood. They were facing away from me, hunched over something on the ground. I pulled the horn. They didn't move. I pulled it again, longer this time. Nothing. I had to get out and check. I stepped down from the truck, flashlight in hand, and approached slowly. As I got closer, I could hear a strange noise. It was like humming but deeper, more like a growl. My skin prickled. The closer I got, the louder it grew. Finally, I was close enough to make out what they were doing. The figure was digging, not with their hands though. They were using some kind of sharp tool, a long, twisted piece of metal they clutched tightly. The ground was soft there, like it had been dug up before. I didn't want to know what was going on. I shouted, "Hey, you okay?" The humming stopped, and slowly, the figure turned. Their face was hidden in the shadow of the hood, but I could see their eyes. They glowed, yellow, like an animal's caught in headlights, and they were staring right at me. I took a step back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The figure just kept staring, and then they did something that still gives me chills. They grinned. I saw the glint of teeth, sharp, uneven, too many for a human mouth. I didn't need to see more. I turned and ran back to my truck, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. As I glanced in the side mirror, I saw the figure rise to its feet, standing tall and still in the middle of the road, watching me. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out, leaving that thing behind. But as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those yellow eyes were still on me. After a few miles, I started to calm down. I told myself it was just some crazy person out in the middle of nowhere, maybe someone who'd lost their mind or was on something. But even then, it didn't sit right with me. Something about those eyes, that grin. I turned on the radio to shake off the feeling. Static. Every station just static. I flicked the dial, hoping for anything, news, a song, even an ad. But all I got was a low, hissing sound that grew louder with every turn of the dial. Then, I heard it. A voice, faint at first, whispering my name. Tom, Tom, Tot. My heart raced. I turned the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. It was there, whispering in the back of my mind, calling my name over and over. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was following me. Every shadow, every flicker of light seemed to hide a figure watching from the trees. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught another figure in the road, just standing there. This one wasn't crouched or digging, it was upright, tall, and facing me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I skidded to a stop just feet away from it. My heart pounded as I sat there, staring at this new figure, trying to make sense of what I was. They were different from the first one. They wore old-fashioned clothes, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, like something out of a black and white photo, but the eyes were the same. Yellow, glowing, fixed on me with that same unblinking stare. I couldn't move. It felt like those eyes were rooting me to the spot, trapping me in the cab of my own truck. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand and pointed down the road, motioning for me to keep going. I didn't know what else to do, so I put the truck in gear and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. The figure stepped to the side as I passed, those eyes following me, never blinking, never looking away. After that, I didn't see any more figures, but the whispering stayed with me, growing louder and more frantic as I drove. It was like dozens of voices, all calling my name, all whispering warnings I couldn't quite make out. Finally, I reached Crescent Ridge just as the sky started to lighten. The voices faded and the radio came back to life, playing some old country song as if nothing had happened. I pulled into the delivery spot, my hands still shaking as I cut the engine and stepped out. I finished the delivery as quickly as I could and got out of there, swearing to myself that I'd never take that road again. But as I pulled onto the main highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was still with me, watching waiting for the next time I drove through their territory. I've driven across most of the country, through every kind of weather, day and night. You get used to the loneliness, the dark stretches, and the strange sights that only truckers get to see. But there's one night that I still can't shake from my mind. A night that left me wondering if the road is haunted in ways I'll never understand. It was mid-January, and I had a load to take from Kansas City down to New Orleans. It was cold, below freezing, and snow was piled up on the sides of the road. I'd been on the road for hours without seeing much more than the faint glow of farmhouses off in the distance. By the time I got to Route 65, it was well past midnight, and I was the only one out there, or so I thought. I needed to make good time to get to the next town, so I kept my foot on the gas, watching the snow blow across the empty highway. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rumble of the engine. I kept the radio low, trying to stay alert, but my eyes were growing heavy, and I was starting to lose focus. That's when I noticed a sign up ahead. It was one of those old, rusty signs you only see on back roads. It read, "Brunswick Rest Area, 2 miles" in faded letters. I didn't remember seeing this rest area before, and I'd driven this route plenty of times, but I figured I must have just missed it on my past trips. I decided to pull over, maybe grab a snack from the back, and stretch my legs. As I got closer, I noticed that the lights in the rest area were dim, almost flickering, but I wasn't about to turn back. I was too tired to keep going without a quick stop. I pulled in and parked my truck, shutting off the engine. The silence settled over me like a thick blanket, and I could see my breath fogging up in the cold air. The place looked deserted. There were no cars, no other trucks, nothing. Just me and the faint hum of the lights. I got out, my boots crunching in the thin layer of snow, and made my way toward the building. It was a small structure, probably built decades ago, with peeling paint and a door that creaked as I pushed it open. The inside was even colder than outside, and it smelled musty, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There was an old vending machine in the corner, humming quietly. I put in a couple of quarters and grabbed a pack of crackers, thinking it'd keep me awake for the next leg of the drive. As I munched on the stale crackers, I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind that has nothing to do with the weather. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed something strange. There was a long hallway at the back of the rest area, leading to a set of bathrooms. But in the dim light, it looked like the hallway went on forever, stretching into darkness. The more I looked, the more I felt something watching me from down there. Trying to shake off the feeling, I turned back toward the main room and froze. There, standing by the entrance, was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned coat, one of those heavy wool ones that looked out of place on a night like this. Her hair was dark, and she stood perfectly still, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I forced myself to smile, trying to be polite. "Hey there, didn't see you come." She didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something off about her gaze. It felt empty, like she was looking through me instead of at me. "Are you okay?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. Still, no answer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I took a step back, keeping my eye on her, but as soon as I moved, she turned and started walking toward the dark hallway at the back. I hesitated, not sure if I should follow. Something about the way she moved, slow and stiff, made me feel uneasy. But part of me was worried. Maybe she was hurt, lost, or just needed help. Against my better judgment, I followed her down the hallway. The air grew colder with every step, and the light from the main room faded until I was almost in total darkness. I could barely see her up ahead, her coat blending into the shadows. "Ma'am?" I called, my voice echoing. "Do you need help?" She didn't answer, just kept walking, deeper into the darkness. The hallway felt like it was stretching out, going farther than it should have. I stopped, glancing back toward the main room, but it was too far now. All I could see was darkness. I turned back toward the woman, but she was gone. I looked around, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it, but there was nothing, just empty, silent darkness. I took a few steps back, my breathing quickening. That's when I heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned and hurried back toward the main room, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and the whispering grew louder, closer, like it was right behind me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I saw the dim light of the main room up ahead. I burst through the doorway, breathing heavily, and looked around. The room was empty, and the vending machine was humming quietly, as if nothing had happened. I didn't waste any time. I rushed out of the building, climbed back into my truck, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing there. But the lot was empty, just shadows stretching across the snow. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I drove down Route 65, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the mirrors, a dark figure standing by the side of the road, watching me as I passed. Hours went by, and the sky started to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the mirrors, afraid of what I might see. But as I reached the edge of the next town, I saw something that made my blood run. There, standing on the side of the road, was the same woman, her dark coat billowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on me with that same empty stare. I drove past her without slowing down, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart pounding. For the rest of the trip, I didn't see her again. But every time I pass a rest area on a dark, empty road, I can't help but feel a chill. I think about that woman, her dark eyes, her silent stare, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for the next driver to Maybe I'll never know who she was or what she wanted. But one thing's for sure, that night on Route 65 will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was just another night on the road for me, a trucker of nearly 10 years. I'd driven through all sorts of weather and at every hour, but I'd never felt fear quite like I did on that cold November night. I was hauling a load of lumber down a back road in northern Michigan, and the radio had just warned about a coming snowstorm. The dispatcher told me to keep going, so I pushed on, hoping to outrun the worst of it. The road was narrow and empty, stretching out under the thick clouds that blocked any hint of moonlight. I was used to isolation, but there was something different that night, a kind of silence that felt heavy, like even the night animals were holding their breath. I kept my eyes on the road, hands on the wheel, trying to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, seeing only darkness stretching behind me. But then, maybe an hour into the trip, I noticed something odd, a pair of headlights far in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another driver, but something was strange. The lights seemed too bright, too steady. Usually, you'd expect some flickering with bumps on a road like this, but these lights never wavered. I kept an eye on them, glancing back every few minutes as they got close. Suddenly, those lights were right on my tail. They seemed to come out of nowhere, close enough that I could barely see anything but blinding white in my mirrors. My heart started pounding. I tapped the brakes, a signal that any trucker would recognize as back off, but whoever was behind me didn't budge. After a few minutes, I decided to let them pass. I slowed down, moving to the shoulder as best I could. The lights pulled around me, and I got a look at the car, or rather, what should have been a car. But what I saw didn't make sense. It looked like an old black sedan, rusted and beat up, with no license plates. But even stranger, it seemed to flicker in and out of view, almost like it was there 1 second and gone the next. The car pulled ahead, speeding up until its lights vanished down the road. I was relieved to see it go, but something about the encounter left me uneasy. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I'd been driving long hours lately, and maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the dark. An hour passed, maybe more. The storm was picking up, snow swirling across the road, making it harder to see. I kept my lights on high, watching the road closely, when suddenly those same headlights appeared again, right behind me. This time, I knew something was wrong. No one should have been able to make it that far ahead of me and still end up back behind me. And that flickering effect was back, the car almost seeming to blink in and out of existence. I pressed down on the gas, trying to put some distance between me and that eerie vehicle. The snow was coming down heavier now, making the road slick, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from whatever that thing was. But no matter how fast I drove, the car stayed right behind me, those bright headlights piercing into my truck's cab. I tried the brakes again, but it didn't respond. In fact, it seemed to get closer. The lights were so bright they filled my whole mirror, almost as if they were trying to burn their way into my eye. I had to do something, so I made a split-second decision and took the next turnoff. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't care. Anything to get away. I skidded onto the side road, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of the car in my mirror, still following close behind. But then, as I rounded the corner, it was gone. Just like that, the road was empty again. I slowed down, catching my breath, my hands shaking on the wheel. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but the road was quiet again. Nothing but the sound of my engine and the faint whisper of the wind. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe the car was just some trick of the mind or an old ghost story brought to life by I drove on, every nerve on edge. But as I went further down the road, I noticed something up ahead. My headlights illuminated a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, coming to a stop a few yards away. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, with his head down. His hair was wild, matted with snow, and he looked like he'd been standing there for a long time. I honked, hoping he'd step aside, but he didn't move. I rolled down the window a bit and called out, "Hey, you okay?" The man looked up slowly, and my heart skipped a beat. His eyes were hollow, empty. No light reflected from them, just blackness staring back at me. I felt frozen in my seat, unable to move or look away. Then he opened his mouth, but no words came out. Just a sound, a horrible low growl that echoed in the silence. Panicking, I rolled the window back up and hit the gas, swerving around him. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see those eyes again. The snow was falling harder now, and visibility was nearly zero, but I just wanted to get away. I focused on the road, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but a few minutes later, something else appeared on the road ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was that same old black car blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a halt. The car sat there, headlights off, silent and still. I could feel my heart racing, sweat pouring down my face despite the cold. For a long moment, nothing happened. I sat there, staring at the car, wondering what it wanted from me. Then, slowly, the driver's door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It was the man from the road, his eyes still hollow, his expression blank. He stood in front of his car, staring at me, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, staring back at him. But then, something snapped inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I jammed the truck into reverse, spinning the wheel, and hit the gas as hard as I could. I didn't care where I went as long as it was away from that road, away from that man, and away from that cursed car. I drove through the night, not stopping until the sun rose. The snow had stopped, and I found myself on a highway far from that back road. I kept driving until I reached the next town, where I parked at a diner and stumbled out of my truck, barely able to stand. The waitress inside gave me a strange look, probably noticing how pale I was, but I didn't care. I sat down and ordered coffee, my hands still shaking as I tried to get warm. I never saw that car again. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I knew one thing for sure: I'd never drive that road again, no matter what. Some things just aren't meant to be understood, and that old black car was one of them. I've been driving trucks for 20 years, seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing, and I mean nothing, ever scared me like that night. I was hauling a load of frozen goods through the backwoods of Tennessee in the dead of winter, pitch black night. It was supposed to be a straightforward run, but that was before I found myself on that road. It started with a detour sign. My GPS said keep going straight, but the sign pointed left down an old narrow road cutting through dense woods. I didn't want to take it. The road looked wrong, all twisted and overgrown, with branches reaching out like hands. But the sign was official looking, so I figured, what the hell, and made the turn. Right away, the air felt heavy, like something was watching. My headlights cut through fog that rolled in from nowhere. That's when I noticed the first odd thing: no sound. My engine hummed, but outside, there wasn't a single cricket, bird, or rustle of leaves. Just thick silence pressing in on me. Then I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, dressed in a thin white nightgown, barefoot, shivering. Looked like she hadn't slept in days, face pale, hair a tangled mess. Now, I've picked up hitchhikers before, but something about her made my skin crawl. Still, I stopped, rolled down the window, and asked if she needed help. She looked at me, her eyes hollow, like they were staring right through me. "They're coming," she whispered. I felt a chill creep down my spine. "Who's coming?" But she just kept staring, then turned and walked right into the woods, disappearing in the fog. I waited a minute, my headlights trying to follow her, but she was gone. That's when I heard it, a low rumbling, like distant thunder. Except it wasn't from the sky, it was coming from behind me. I looked in my mirrors and saw lights. 2, T3, no, at least 5 sets of headlights, way too close together, like a pack. They were coming fast, bouncing over the rough road, getting closer with every second. I hit the gas, tried to outrun them, but my truck felt heavy, like something was dragging me back. Those headlights kept getting closer until I could make out the shapes behind them. Old trucks and cars, rusted, broken, with no drivers. I swear to you, they were driving themselves. One of them, an old black pickup with a shattered windshield, pulled up alongside me. I glanced over, and I'll never forget what I saw. There was a shadow in the driver's seat, a figure with hollow eyes, staring at me with a grin too wide, teeth too sharp. My truck started slowing down. I floored the pedal, but the engine whined and sputtered like it was fighting me. The trucks were all around me now, closing in, headlights flashing like wild eyes in the night. Then, just when I thought I was done for, the road turned, opening up onto the main highway. The instant my tires hit the pavement, the fog lifted, and the rumbling was gone. I looked back, and there was nothing, no trucks, no lights, no girl. Just an empty, dark road behind me. I never took that road again. Now, whenever I see a detour sign, I stick to the main road. And when people ask why, I tell them, some roads weren't meant to be traveled, and some things weren't meant to be seen.